An elderly black woman, her movements slow but dignified, steps into the bustling first-class cabin of an early morning flight. Dressed in a neatly pressed suit and clutching a worn leather handbag, she radiates a quiet confidence that defies her age. Yet, as she approaches her seat, the flight attendant assigned to the section pauses, her polished smile faltering ever so slightly. In that moment, a split-second judgment is made, one that sets off a cascade of events no one could have anticipated. When the flight attendant, blinded by long-held biases she barely recognizes, questions the elderly woman's ticket and her right to occupy the premium seat, the cabin falls silent. What follows is a confrontation that not only exposes unspoken prejudices but also forces everyone in that confined space, passengers and crew alike, to confront the deeper truths of equality, dignity, and respect. Stay with me, because this is not just a story of a misunderstanding. It's a tale of resilience, courage, and the extraordinary power one act of quiet defiance can have in transforming an entire industry. By the time the plane touches down, lessons will have been learned, lives will be forever changed, and an airline's policies will be rewritten to honor what it truly means to treat every passenger with respect. Before we dive into the details of this unforgettable story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today, and if you believe stories like these deserve to be heard. Don't forget to subscribe for more impactful tales that inspire change. The morning air at New Orleans International Airport was as heavy as the unspoken tensions that sometimes simmered between strangers in crowded spaces. The day began unremarkably. Travelers shuffled through security lines, wheeled bags clicked against the tiled floors, and announcements crackled from overhead speakers in calm, detached tones. The soft gold of the sunrise outside bathed the terminal in a deceptive serenity. In the staff lounge, Chloe Watkins stood before the mirror, adjusting the crisp lapels of her uniform. Her dark blue blazer was spotless, the pins on her lapel polished to a military shine. Chloe was proud of her job as a senior flight attendant. She had worked hard to earn her place, climbing through the ranks with precision and discipline. Her father's voice echoed in her mind as she tightened her French twist. Order is the only way to keep the world from falling apart. Chloe, don't let anyone forget who's in charge. She straightened her name tag and allowed herself a final approving nod before stepping into the bustling terminal. Her polished shoes clicked sharply against the floors as she headed toward Gate 23, where Flight 567 was boarding. The plane would carry a mix of executives, retirees, and families on their way to New York. To Chloe, they were simply passengers' names and seat numbers to be served with efficiency and grace. But not all passengers were created equal. The boarding process began smoothly. Businessmen in tailored suits exchanged polite nods. A young mother cradled her crying baby, and retirees clutching travel guides shuffled toward their seats. Chloe greeted each passenger with a perfectly practiced smile, the kind that concealed any hint of personal opinion. The airline had taught her well, professionalism above all. Then Diana Thompson approached. Diana was the kind of woman who commanded attention without trying. Her silver-streaked hair was pulled into an elegant bun, her tailored gray pantsuit as immaculate as Chloe's uniform. She held herself with quiet confidence, her leather briefcase swinging lightly at her side. But it wasn't Diana's poise that made Chloe pause. It was her skin, a deep, rich brown that clashed with Chloe's unspoken expectations of who belonged in first class. "Good morning," Diana said warmly as she handed over her boarding pass. Chloe's smile faltered ever so slightly. She scanned the pass. Seat 1A. First class. The corner of her mouth tightened for just a moment before she gestured toward the cabin. "This way, ma'am," Chloe said, her tone clipped. Diana nodded graciously and moved toward her seat. But Chloe's eyes lingered. She watched as Diana settled into the plush leather seat, adjusting her briefcase and pulling out a notebook. The image felt wrong, though Chloe couldn't articulate why. Her father's words echoed again. People need to know their place. She dismissed the thought, shaking it off like lint from her sleeve, and continued greeting passengers. But the moment stuck. As the flight progressed, Chloe found herself circling back to Diana's seat, her steps slower each time. Something about the older woman unsettled her. It wasn't just the calm, self-assured way Diana carried herself. It was the silent reminder that Chloe's world, a world of clear boundaries and expectations, wasn't as orderly as she liked to believe. Midway through the flight, Chloe returned to Diana with a tight smile. "Excuse me, ma'am," she said, her voice professional but firm. "May I see your boarding pass again?" Diana looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. Of course. She handed over the pass without hesitation. Her movements deliberate. Chloe studied the ticket as though searching for a mistake. There was none. Seat 1A. Perfectly legitimate. "This is first class," Chloe said, her voice neutral but pointed. "I'm aware," Diana replied evenly, her eyes meeting Chloe's with calm intensity. The moment stretched, silent and electric. Passengers nearby exchanged glances. A man in one seat cleared his throat, casting a wary look at Chloe. "Problem?" he asked sharply. "No, sir," Chloe said quickly, handing the pass back to Diana. "Everything is fine." But it wasn't. Chloe felt the weight of eyes on her as she retreated to the galley. Her hands trembled as she reached for the counter to steady herself. Her father's voice returned, unbidden. "Don't let anyone see weakness." She straightened her back and forced her thoughts into order. Meanwhile, Diana returned to her notes, her pen moving smoothly across the page. But she wasn't as unaffected as she appeared. She had faced this kind of scrutiny before, the questioning looks, the unspoken challenges. It didn't surprise her anymore. But it didn't hurt any less. Her years as a psychologist had taught her to recognize the subtle cracks in people's facades. And Chloe's unease was practically palpable. Across the aisle, Jake Morrison, a sharply dressed black businessman, watched the interaction from behind his steaming coffee. His Rolex caught the overhead light as he shifted in his seat. His expression thoughtful. He had seen this before, too. The cabin's rhythm continued, steady but taut, like a string pulled just shy of snapping. Then the turbulence hit. It started as a faint tremor, barely noticeable, but within minutes, the plane rocked violently, sending cups clattering and passengers gripping their armrests. Overhead bins rattled ominously as the seatbelt sign dinged urgently. In the back row of first class, an older man named Tom Harper began to panic. His breathing grew rapid, his face pale. Chloe rushed toward him, tray in hand, but froze as his anxiety escalated. "I can't breathe," Tom gasped, clutching his chest. Passengers turned to stare. Chloe hesitated, her mind scrambling for the protocols she had memorized in training. But the sight of his trembling hands and wide, terrified eyes paralyzed her. Then Diana stood. She moved with purpose, her calm presence cutting through the rising tension. Kneeling beside Tom, she placed a hand on his arm and spoke softly. "Focus on me," she said, her voice steady. "Inhale slowly. Hold it. Now exhale. You're safe." Tom's breathing began to slow. Diana guided him through each breath, her words a lifeline in the chaos. Chloe watched, rooted to the spot. She had never seen anyone take control like this, not with force, but with compassion. The contrast to her father's teachings was stark, almost blinding. She felt a pang of something she couldn't quite name, guilt, perhaps, or admiration. As the turbulence subsided, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Chloe returned to the galley, but the knot in her chest only tightened. For the first time in her career, she felt like a stranger in her own domain. The rules she had lived by, rules of control, authority, and detachment, suddenly felt inadequate. In the aisle, Diana sat back in her seat, her calm composure intact. But Chloe couldn't stop thinking about the older woman's gaze, steady and unyielding, as if daring Chloe to see the world differently. And for the first time, Chloe wondered if she could. The cabin hummed with an uneasy quiet after the turbulence. Passengers murmured among themselves, exchanging nervous smiles and half-hearted reassurances. The air felt thick, not from the altitude, but from the invisible tension that seemed to linger in the wake of Diana Thompson's intervention. Chloe Watkins stood in the galley, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. The familiar rhythm of her job, once so comforting, now felt hollow. She replayed the moment with Tom Harper in her mind. The way she had frozen. The way Diana had stepped in calm, commanding, and entirely unbothered by the kind of scrutiny that Chloe had spent her life trying to avoid. The contrast gnawed at her, a growing discomfort she couldn't shake. Her father's voice crept into her thoughts, controlled the room. "Chloe, don't let anyone question your authority. If they do, you've already lost." But Diana hadn't controlled the moment with authority. She had led with something far more profound, humanity. Diana, meanwhile, returned to her seat, settling back into her notebook as if nothing had happened. Her movements were unhurried, almost meditative, but her mind was sharp. Dissecting the encounter, she had seen the look in Chloe's eyes, uncertainty masked as composure. It was a look she knew well, one she had encountered time and again in her years of working with people who lived by rules they didn't question. Across the aisle, Jake Morrison leaned toward Diana, his voice low. "You handled that well," he said, his tone filled with admiration. "Not everyone could have." Diana glanced at him, offering a small smile. "Sometimes all it takes is listening," she replied. "Most people just need someone to meet them where they are." Jake nodded but didn't say more. His gaze drifted toward Chloe, who was now moving stiffly through the aisle. Her usual confidence dimmed. He recognized the battle playing out within her. It was the same battle he had fought in boardrooms, at dinner tables, in the quiet spaces where his presence alone had been enough to disrupt the comfort of others. The plane jolted again, a sudden dip that sent gasps through the cabin. The turbulence wasn't as severe as before, but it was enough to reignite anxiety. Chloe moved quickly, steadying a tray of drinks that threatened to spill. Her practiced smile returned, but it was fragile, like porcelain held together by brittle glue. "Everything's fine, folks," she said, her voice a touch too loud. "Just a little turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Diana watched her closely, noting the tightness in Chloe's jaw, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly. There was a storm within Chloe that no amount of training could suppress. At the back of first class, Tom Harper stirred in his seat. His breathing had steadied, but his eyes darted to the window, then to the seatbelt sign, then back again. Anxiety lingered like a shadow, and Diana could see it spreading to the passengers around him. The young mother a few rows back held her baby closer, her lips moving in whispered reassurance. Jake adjusted his watch, his expression unreadable but tense. Chloe returned to the galley, her movements quick and sharp. She reached for a cup of water but paused, her hand hovering over the counter. Her chest felt tight, her breath shallow. She pressed a hand to her sternum, trying to ground herself, but the weight of her own inadequacy pressed harder. "Get it together," she muttered under her breath, but the words rang hollow. The intercom crackled. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are encountering a patch of severe turbulence," the captain announced. "Please remain seated. We'll update you as we navigate through this area." The plane shuddered violently, sending trays clattering and passengers gripping their seats. A child's cry pierced the air, followed by murmurs of unease. Chloe hurried down the aisle, checking seatbelts and reassuring passengers, but the tension in her voice only seemed to amplify the unease. As she approached Diana's row, her steps slowed. Diana looked up, meeting Chloe's gaze with calm, unflinching eyes. "Are you all right?" Diana asked, her tone gentle but direct. Chloe stiffened. "I'm fine," she said quickly, too quickly. Her eyes darted away, but Diana didn't press. Instead, she said quietly, "It's okay to admit when you're not." The turbulence worsened, the plane jerking as if caught in a fist of air. Overhead bins rattled ominously, and a few passengers yelped. Chloe felt the familiar urge to take control, to impose order, but no amount of polished professionalism could steady the chaos around her. In the midst of the commotion, Tom Harper's panic resurfaced. His breathing quickened, his hands clutching the armrests with white-knuckled intensity. Diana rose from her seat, steadying herself against the aisle as the plane rocked. "Tom," she said firmly, kneeling beside him once more. "Look at me." He didn't respond, his eyes wide and unfocused. Diana reached for his hand, her voice cutting through the noise like a lifeline. "Tom, you're safe. Focus on my voice. Inhale slowly. Now exhale." Her calmness was contagious. Nearby passengers who had been on the edge of panic began to settle, their gazes fixed on Diana as if her steadiness could anchor them all. Chloe stood a few steps away, frozen. She watched as Diana turned chaos into calm, not with authority but with empathy. For the first time, Chloe felt the full weight of her father's teachings, the rigidity, the control, the unspoken biases that had shaped her every action. And for the first time, she questioned them. A passenger from the economy cabin appeared at the divider, peeking into first class with wide eyes. "Is everything okay up here?" she asked nervously. Chloe opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. Instead, Diana looked up, her expression steady. "We're managing," Diana said. "Everything's under control." The woman nodded, reassured, and returned to her seat. Chloe felt a pang of shame. She was supposed to be the one in control, but it was Diana who had taken the reins, who had turned a moment of fear into one of connection. As the turbulence began to ease, Chloe approached Diana, her steps hesitant. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely audible, "for helping him, for everything." Diana looked at her, her gaze soft but unyielding. "It's not about me," she said simply. "It's about all of us." Chloe nodded, but the knot in her chest remained. She knew this flight wasn't just a test of her professionalism, it was a test of her humanity. And she wasn't sure she was passing. The cabin settled momentarily, a deceptive calm stretching across the rows of seats. Outside the window, the horizon was a patchwork of roiling clouds and streaks of sunlight. A silent reflection of the growing tension within. Chloe Watkins took slow, deliberate breaths in the galley, trying to steady the tremor in her hands. Her uniform, usually a shield of authority and confidence, felt like a weight dragging her down. She glanced toward the first-class cabin, where Diana Thompson sat quietly. Her focus now returned to her leather-bound notebook. Chloe had always taken pride in her ability to maintain control, but Diana's composed, compassionate demeanor had unseated her, unraveling the certainty that had once defined her. It was the small things that began to fray the fragile equilibrium. A passenger in the economy cabin complained loudly about the turbulence, accusing the airline of negligence. A baby's piercing cries echoed, slicing through the air like a knife. In first class, Jake Morrison tapped his fingers against his armrest, his gaze flitting between Chloe and Diana. The tension wasn't overt, but it was palpable, a silent question of who would step up if things escalated again. And then, they did. The plane jolted violently, sending trays and unsecured bags flying. Passengers gasped, some crying out in fear. Chloe's training kicked in, and she gripped the overhead bins for balance as she hurried back into the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady over the intercom, "we're experiencing some turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened." Her words hung in the air, offering little comfort to the passengers whose knuckles turned white against the armrests. Chloe moved down the aisle, her steps deliberate, but inside, her thoughts churned. Her father's lessons, those rigid lines between strength and weakness. Order and chaos felt inadequate in the face of this moment. Near the rear of first class, Tom Harper was unraveling again. His chest heaved, his breaths shallow and erratic. Chloe reached his row just as Diana stood, her movements deliberate and calm despite the plane's unsteady sway. "Tom," Diana said firmly, kneeling beside him, "you've been here before. You've faced worse. Remember how you survived?" Chloe froze, her hand hovering near the seatback for support. The words "you've faced worse" echoed in her mind, and she saw something flicker across Tom's face: pain, recognition, and then something deeper: shame. "Everyone called me a hero," Tom rasped, his voice choked with anguish. "But I couldn't save them. My wife, my daughter." The cabin seemed to shrink around them, the murmurs of other passengers fading into a dull hum. Diana's expression softened, but her voice remained steady. "You did everything you could," she said, placing a hand on his trembling arm. "Survival isn't about perfection, it's about resilience." Chloe watched, torn between admiration and unease. She wanted to intervene, to assert herself, but something held her back. Diana's presence was commanding, not through force but through understanding. It was a language Chloe had never been taught, one that her father's lessons had never accounted for. The plane lurched again, throwing Chloe off balance. She caught herself against the seatback, her heart racing. Across the aisle, Jake Morrison stood, offering his support to steady her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his tone quiet but pointed. Chloe nodded quickly, brushing off the moment, but Jake didn't move. His eyes lingered, searching hers for something unspoken. "You don't have to prove anything," he said softly. "Not to us, not to yourself." His words cut deeper than he could have known. Chloe felt a pang of defensiveness, followed by the sharp sting of recognition. She had spent her entire career proving herself, proving that she belonged, that she was capable, that she was in control. But in this moment, control felt like a brittle mask, ready to crack. The turbulence finally eased, the plane leveling out as the captain's voice came through the intercom with an update. The cabin exhaled collectively, the tension dissipating but not disappearing. Chloe took the opportunity to retreat to the galley, where she leaned against the counter, her thoughts a storm of their own. The door to the galley swung open, and Diana entered, her expression unreadable. "Are you all right?" Diana asked, her tone calm but probing. Chloe straightened, forcing her professional demeanor back into place. "Of course," she said, her voice clipped. "Just doing my job." Diana studied her for a moment, her silence heavy with meaning. "You know," Diana said finally, "control isn't the same as strength." The words hit like a blow, and Chloe's facade cracked. "I've spent my whole life believing it is," Chloe admitted, her voice trembling despite herself. "My father always said, he always told me that letting emotions get in the way would make me weak." Diana nodded, her expression softening. "And has it?" Chloe opened her mouth to respond, but the answer stuck in her throat. She thought of the moments she had frozen during the flight. The way Diana had stepped in without hesitation. Weakness wasn't what she had seen in Diana, it was strength, but of a kind she had never understood. The cabin's rhythm returned to a fragile normalcy, but the cracks beneath the surface remained. Chloe returned to the aisle, her steps steadier but her mind unsettled. As she passed Tom Harper's seat, she paused. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice catching. Tom looked up, his eyes still red-rimmed but calmer now. "You don't need to apologize," he said, his voice raw but earnest. "We're all just trying to get through." The words struck Chloe with their simplicity. They weren't an accusation, but they weren't absolution, either. They were a reminder, a challenge. As the plane began its descent, the city lights of New York glimmering below, Chloe felt the weight of the flight settling over her. It wasn't just the turbulence or the passengers' fear, it was the collision of her past and present, the lessons she had carried with her and the truths she could no longer ignore. And as the wheels touched down, the applause from the cabin rang hollow in her ears. For the first time, Chloe felt the urge to be more than professional. She wanted to be human. The wheels of the plane screeched against the runway, jolting the passengers forward in their seats. Applause rippled through the cabin, but it was tentative, weighed down by the tension that had defined the flight. Chloe Watkins stood near the galley, her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on the aisle as the passengers began to gather their belongings. The flight had landed, but for Chloe, the journey felt far from over. As the passengers disembarked, Diana Thompson waited patiently in her seat, letting the rush of travelers pass. Tom Harper lingered too, his shoulders slumped but his breathing steady, a small victory that Diana had helped him achieve. Chloe watched them both, feeling a strange pull. She wanted to say something. But what? The words that came to her felt insufficient, hollow. It wasn't until the cabin was nearly empty that Diana rose. Her briefcase in hand, she turned to Chloe, her gaze steady but unreadable. "Thank you for getting us here safely," Diana said, her tone deliberate. Chloe blinked, startled by the formality of the statement. "I didn't do much," she stammered. Diana tilted her head slightly. "Sometimes it's not about what you do. It's about what you learn." In the terminal, the atmosphere was different. The hum of announcements, the hurried steps of travelers' life was moving on, oblivious to the quiet storms carried by those who had just landed. Chloe stood at the gate, watching as Diana and Tom disappeared into the crowd. She felt an ache, a hollowness she couldn't name. For years, her uniform had been her armor, her role as a flight attendant her shield. But now, she felt exposed. She didn't notice Jake Morrison approaching until he was standing beside her. "You've been quiet," he said, his voice low but kind. Chloe glanced at him, then looked away, her gaze dropping to the polished floor. "I'm just processing." Jake chuckled softly. "Processing can be uncomfortable, but it's necessary." Chloe exhaled sharply, frustrated. "I don't know what I'm supposed to feel right now." Jake's expression softened. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe it's not about knowing, it's about questioning." As Chloe left the terminal and stepped into the humid New York air, the city's energy pressed in on her. The honking of horns, the chatter of pedestrians, the distant hum of subway trains, it was chaos. But it was alive. She hailed a cab and sank into the backseat, staring out the window as the city blurred past. Her thoughts churned, each memory from the flight a thread pulling at the fabric of her understanding. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. You need to stay in control. Chloe, never let them see you sweat. But she had sweated, she had faltered, and the world hadn't ended. That evening, Chloe sat in her small apartment, the silence heavy around her. She reached for her phone and hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. Then, with a deep breath, she opened her messages and typed, "Thank you for today. I didn't say it earlier, but I learned a lot watching you. Chloe." She hesitated again, then hit send. The message felt inadequate, but it was a start. Across the city, Diana sat at a quiet cafe, her notebook open in front of her. Her phone buzzed, and she glanced at the screen. Seeing Chloe's message, a faint smile tugged at the corners of her lips. She didn't reply immediately. Instead, she picked up her pen and began to write. The following week, Chloe found herself on another flight, the routine feeling strangely unfamiliar. Every interaction, every passenger's face, carried a new weight. She noticed things she hadn't before: the mother struggling with her toddler, the elderly man fumbling with his seatbelt, the nervous flyer gripping the armrest. She found herself pausing, asking questions, offering a hand. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was a shift. The real test came when a young black woman in economy approached the galley mid-flight. She looked nervous, clutching a boarding pass in one hand and a book in the other. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft. "I think there's been a mistake with my seat assignment." Chloe took the pass and glanced at it. The woman was seated in economy but had a ticket for first class. Chloe's first instinct was to question, to ask how this had happened, to verify the ticket again. But then she caught herself. She thought of Diana, of Jake, of the countless small moments that had begun to chip away at her old reflexes. Instead, Chloe smiled. "Let's get this sorted out," she said, her tone warm. The woman's shoulders relaxed, her expression shifting from apprehension to relief. When Chloe walked through the terminal after that flight, she felt different, lighter. Somehow, the change wasn't monumental, but it was there, a seed planted, a lesson learned. And as she left the airport, the city alive around her, she felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. Hope that she could be more. Hope that she could unlearn the things that had held her back. Hope that she could meet the world not with control, but with connection. The sun had just begun to dip below the Manhattan skyline, casting long shadows across Chloe Watkins' small apartment. She sat at her kitchen table, a cup of coffee growing cold in front of her, untouched. Her phone lay face up, the screen glowing faintly with a single message. "Would you like to meet for coffee? Diana." It had been days since she'd sent her own message of gratitude. And now, faced with a chance to speak with Diana Thompson in person, Chloe found herself hesitant. What would she say? How could she explain the gnawing discomfort, the questions that had burrowed into her since that flight? Her finger hovered over the screen. She tapped yes and hit send. The next afternoon, Chloe found herself at a quiet cafe in Brooklyn. The space was cozy but alive with energy, the hiss of an espresso machine, the low hum of conversation, the occasional clink of a spoon against porcelain. Diana was already there, seated at a small table near the window. She looked calm, as always, her silver-streaked hair catching the sunlight. "Chloe." Diana greeted her with a warm smile. "I'm glad you came." Chloe slid into the seat across from her, feeling oddly nervous. She glanced at the notebook on the table, the same one Diana had been writing in on the plane. "I wasn't sure what to expect," Chloe admitted, her voice quieter than she intended. Diana tilted her head slightly, studying Chloe with those sharp, discerning eyes. "Neither was I, but I thought we might have more to talk about." The words were gentle, but they carried weight. Chloe nodded slowly, searching for where to begin. At first, their conversation was light. They talked about the flight, the turbulence, Tom Harper's panic attack. But as the minutes ticked by, Chloe felt the layers of formality begin to peel away. Diana's calm presence, her quiet authority, invited honesty in a way that Chloe found disarming. "I froze," Chloe said finally, her hands wrapping around her coffee cup. "When Tom needed help, I just froze. I've never done that before." Diana leaned back slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Why do you think that happened?" Chloe hesitated. "I don't know. Maybe it was the way he looked at me. Or maybe," she trailed off, her throat tightening, "maybe I was afraid of doing the wrong thing." Diana didn't rush her. Instead, she let the silence settle between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. My father always told me to follow the rules. Chloe continued, to stay in control, but on that flight, control felt useless, and I hated how much I relied on you to fix it. Diana's gaze softened. It's not weakness to rely on others. Chloe, it's human. Their conversation deepened, weaving between Chloe's upbringing and Diana's experiences as a black woman navigating spaces that often sought to diminish her. Chloe spoke hesitantly at first, then with growing urgency, about her father's lessons, the unspoken biases he had passed down like family heirlooms. He used to say things like, "People need to know their place," Chloe admitted, shame coloring her voice. And I believed him. I thought that was just how the world worked. Diana's expression remained calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes, sadness. Perhaps, or recognition. It's not uncommon, Diana said gently. We inherit these ideas from the people who raise us. But we're not bound by them. The real question is, what do you want to do now? Before Chloe could answer, their conversation was interrupted by the sudden crash of dishes in the kitchen. The noise startled them both, and Chloe glanced around, her heart racing. The cafe had grown busier, the chatter louder, the atmosphere charged. She noticed, for the first time, the subtle dynamics playing out around them. The way the staff seemed to hesitate before approaching certain tables. The way some patrons avoided meeting the eyes of the black barista at the counter. Chloe's stomach twisted. She had never noticed these things before, but now they stood out like cracks in a polished surface. Diana followed her gaze, her lips pressing into a thin line. It's everywhere, Chloe, she said quietly. You don't always see it, but it's there. Chloe swallowed hard. How do you deal with it? How do you stay so composed? Diana's laugh was soft but tinged with weariness. Composed isn't the same as unaffected. I've spent my whole life navigating these spaces, Chloe, but that doesn't mean it doesn't hurt. Their conversation was interrupted again, this time by a man at a nearby table. He was middle-aged, well-dressed, and visibly agitated. His voice rose, sharp and condescending, as he addressed the black waitress serving him. I asked for this 10 minutes ago, he snapped, waving his hand dismissively. Do I need to speak to someone in charge? The waitress froze, her expression tightening as she tried to remain professional. Chloe felt her pulse quicken, her stomach knotting. Diana didn't hesitate. She turned in her seat, her voice firm but measured. Is there a problem? She asked, her tone carrying the kind of authority that demanded attention. The man glanced at Diana, his annoyance flickering into discomfort. I'm just saying the service here could be better. Or perhaps your patience could be. Diana replied, her gaze unwavering. The man flushed, muttered something under his breath, and turned back to his meal. The waitress shot Diana a look of gratitude before hurrying away. Chloe sat frozen, her heart pounding. The interaction had been brief, but it carried an intensity that left her breathless. You didn't have to do that, Chloe said finally, her voice shaking. Yes, I did, Diana replied simply. Because if I don't, who will? As the cafe settled back into its rhythm, Chloe felt a shift within herself, a crack in the foundation of everything she had once believed. She looked at Diana, who returned her gaze with quiet determination. I don't know if I can unlearn everything, Chloe admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. But I want to try. Diana reached across the table, placing a hand over Chloe's. That's all anyone can ask. But trying means speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then. When Chloe left the cafe that evening, the city felt different. The streets were the same, the people moving with the same hurried urgency. But Chloe felt as though she were seeing it all for the first time. The cracks were everywhere, and now that she had noticed them, she couldn't look away. For the first time in her life, Chloe didn't want to. And for the first time, she felt ready to do something about it. The city had slipped into twilight, its streets alive with lights that flickered like restless spirits. Chloe Watkins walked briskly down the avenue, the echoes of her conversation with Diana Thompson ringing in her ears. Each step felt heavier than the last, her thoughts circling around the same question. What am I supposed to do now? Her phone buzzed in her pocket, jolting her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her airline's HR department, a request to attend a meeting the following morning. Chloe frowned. Meetings like this were usually routine, but something about the timing made her uneasy. She shoved the phone back into her pocket and quickened her pace, eager to reach the safety of her apartment. The next morning, Chloe sat stiffly in the conference room, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Across from her was Margaret Hollis, the airline's operations manager, a woman known for her no-nonsense demeanor. Margaret's glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she flipped through a file. "We've received some feedback about your performance on Flight 567. Margaret began, her tone neutral but sharp. Chloe's stomach tightened. "Feedback?" she echoed, her voice wary. "Yes," Margaret said, glancing up at her. "Several passengers noted your professionalism. But there were also concerns about how you handled the situation with Mr. Harper." Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. "Concerns?" she repeated, her voice quieter now. Margaret leaned forward, her expression softening slightly. "Look, Chloe, I know you're experienced, but situations like that require more than just protocol. They require empathy, connection, the kind of leadership that reassures everyone on board not just through words, but through action." The critique wasn't harsh, but it cut deep. Chloe nodded numbly, her mind racing. The truth was, Margaret was right. Chloe had relied on the veneer of professionalism, but it had cracked under pressure, leaving her exposed and uncertain. "We're rolling out new training programs focused on emotional intelligence," Margaret continued. "I think it would be beneficial for you to participate." Chloe's first instinct was to push back, to defend herself, but instead, she took a deep breath and said, "I understand. I'd like to participate." The training session was held the following week, in a bright, airy conference room filled with other flight attendants. Chloe felt out of place, her usual confidence replaced by a simmering discomfort. The instructor, a charismatic man named Marcus Fields, began the session by asking a simple question. "What does it mean to really see someone?" The room was silent. Chloe shifted in her seat, avoiding eye contact. Marcus let the question linger before continuing. "We're trained to see passengers as tickets, as seat assignments, as safety protocols. But when was the last time you looked at a passenger and saw their humanity?" The question hung in the air, and Chloe felt it land squarely on her shoulders. As the training progressed, Chloe found herself confronting uncomfortable truths not just about her actions on the plane, but about the way she had been conditioned to think. Exercises in active listening, role-playing scenarios of conflict, and discussions about implicit bias forced her to look inward, to acknowledge the parts of herself she had long ignored. During a break, she struck up a conversation with another participant, Lila, a junior flight attendant who shared her own struggles. "It's not easy, is it?" Lila said, her voice tinged with vulnerability. "Admitting that you've been part of the problem." Chloe nodded, her throat tight. "No, it's not." The real test came 2 weeks later. During a routine flight to Atlanta, Chloe was working the economy cabin when a commotion broke out near the rear. A middle-aged white man was raising his voice, pointing accusingly at a young black woman seated beside him. "She's invading my space," he barked, his voice loud enough to draw attention. "She's taking up more room than her seat allows." The young woman, visibly shaken, tried to explain that she had simply adjusted her seat to get more comfortable. Her voice trembled as she spoke, her words drowned out by the man's tirade. Chloe's heart pounded as she approached the scene. She could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on her, waiting to see how she would handle this. The memory of Diana's calm, steady presence flashed in her mind. "Sir," Chloe said, keeping her voice even but firm, "I need you to lower your voice." The man glared at her. "This is unacceptable. I paid for this seat, and I expect to be comfortable." "And so does she," Chloe replied, her tone steady. "I understand you're upset, but I need you to treat her with respect." The man opened his mouth to argue, but Chloe raised a hand, cutting him off. "If there's an issue, we can discuss it calmly. But yelling and making someone feel unwelcome isn't going to solve anything." To her surprise, the man sank back into his seat, grumbling but subdued. Chloe turned to the young woman, who was clutching her bag tightly, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Are you okay?" Chloe asked softly. The woman nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you." As Chloe walked back to the galley, her hands trembled not from fear, but from the adrenaline of standing up, of choosing to act rather than remain silent. She realized, in that moment, that the weight of change wasn't a burden, it was a responsibility. Later, as the plane descended into Atlanta, Chloe found herself reflecting on the encounter. She thought of her father, of the lessons he had drilled into her about control and authority. But for the first time, those lessons felt smaller, less important. What mattered now was the look of relief on the young woman's face. The knowledge that Chloe had made a difference. And as the wheels touched down, Chloe felt a quiet resolve take root within her. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. It would be filled with moments of doubt, of discomfort, of conflict. But it would also be filled with growth. And that, she realized, was worth everything. The terminal at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport buzzed with its usual symphony of announcements. Hurried footsteps, and the occasional burst of laughter from travelers reunited with loved ones. Chloe Watkins stood near the departure gate, her hand clutching her boarding pass. She wasn't working this flight this time. She was a passenger, and for the first time in years, she felt the unfamiliar weight of uncertainty. The airline's training program had planted a seed, but Chloe knew that understanding bias and injustice in theory was very different from facing it in the world. She thought of Diana's words during their coffee. Trying means speaking up. Even when it's uncomfortable. Especially then. Chloe wondered if she had it in her to live up to that. Her thoughts were interrupted by a voice. Watkins. Right? She turned to see Jake Morrison, the businessman from Flight 567, approaching with his signature polished demeanor. He offered a small smile, gesturing toward the boarding line. Didn't think I'd see you here. Jake said. Me neither, Chloe replied, trying to match his ease. Jake raised an eyebrow. Nervous? Something like that. Jake chuckled knowingly. Well, if there's one thing I've learned, it's that growth never happens in the comfort zone. Chloe nodded, his words a quiet reassurance. But the pit in her stomach remained. The flight itself began smoothly enough. Chloe found her seat near the back, a vantage point she had rarely experienced as a flight attendant. She watched as passengers filed in, businesspeople with laptops, families juggling strollers and backpacks, and an older black man with a cane who moved slowly, his every step deliberate. Chloe's eyes followed him as he approached his seat near the front of the cabin. She noticed the way some passengers glanced at him, their expressions neutral but loaded with unspoken judgment. The man struggled to lift his small carry-on into the overhead bin. A flight attendant moved toward him but stopped short, hesitating as though unsure whether to help. Chloe's chest tightened. This was one of those moments, small, seemingly inconsequential, but heavy with meaning. She rose from her seat and approached. Let me help you with that, she said, reaching for the bag. The man turned to her, his face lined with age and weariness. Thank you, young lady, he said softly. The flight attendant, a young woman named Megan, gave Chloe a grateful nod. But Chloe couldn't help noticing the tension in her shoulders. Megan's hesitation hadn't been out of malice, Chloe realized, but out of the same uncertainty that had once paralyzed her. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into a quiet rhythm. Chloe returned to her seat, but her attention lingered on the older man. He sat quietly, his hands resting on his knees, his gaze distant. Chloe couldn't shake the feeling that he carried a story, one that was heavier than the bag she had lifted for him. Her thoughts were interrupted by raised voices a few rows ahead. She leaned forward, trying to make sense of the commotion. A white man in his 40s was gesturing angrily at a black teenager seated beside him. This is ridiculous, the man said loudly. Your music is too loud. Have some respect for other passengers. The teenager, wearing headphones, looked startled. He fumbled to lower the volume on his phone. Sorry, sir, he mumbled. Sorry isn't good enough, the man snapped. People like you have no manners. The words hit like a slap. Chloe felt her pulse quicken, her hands clenching the armrests. She looked around, expecting anyone to intervene. But the other passengers avoided eye contact. Their faces turned toward windows or books. Chloe stood, her heart raced as she approached the row, her voice steady but firm. Excuse me, sir, she said, addressing the man. Is there a problem here? The man turned to her, his face flushed with anger. Yes, there is. This kid thinks it's appropriate to blast his music in a shared space. The teenager shrank in his seat, his head lowered. Chloe nodded. I understand that the volume was an issue, but it's been addressed. There's no need for further confrontation. The man scoffed. You're defending him? Of course you are. The comment hung in the air, dripping with implication. Chloe felt a familiar heat rise in her chest, the same anger and shame she had felt on Flight 567. But this time, she didn't freeze. "I'm defending respect," Chloe said evenly, "and I expect it to be mutual. If you have further concerns, I suggest you address them with the crew." The man grumbled but relented. Sinking back into his seat, Chloe turned to the teenager, her voice softening. "Are you okay?" she asked. The boy nodded, but his eyes were downcast. Chloe placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder before returning to her seat. She felt the weight of dozens of eyes on her, but she didn't care. For the first time, she felt like she had done something right. The flight landed in Washington, D.C., and passengers began disembarking. Chloe waited near the exit, watching as the teenager passed by. He paused, glancing at her hesitantly. "Thank you," he said quietly. Chloe smiled. "Take care of yourself." The older man with the cane was next. He stopped and looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "You remind me of someone," he said finally. "A woman I knew during the marches in the 60s. She had your fire." Chloe felt her throat tighten. "That's kind of you to say." The man nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Don't lose it." As Chloe stepped into the terminal, she felt the familiar hum of the airport around her. But this time, it wasn't just noise. It was possibility, a reminder that every space, no matter how ordinary, could become a battleground for dignity and respect. And as she walked toward the exit, she realized that she wasn't afraid of the fight. Not anymore. The evening sun bathed Washington, D.C., in hues of amber and gold, its light reflecting off the stately monuments that loomed over the bustling streets. Chloe Watkins exited the terminal with her bags slung over her shoulder. Her steps steady but her mind restless. Each step brought her closer to her destination, an event she wasn't sure she was ready for. Diana Thompson had invited her to attend a panel discussion on race, equity, and the hidden dynamics of power. Chloe had agreed, reluctantly, knowing it was a space where she couldn't hide behind her uniform or her role as a flight attendant. The event was held in a historic church, its high ceilings and stained glass windows creating an atmosphere both solemn and vibrant. The pews were filled with a diverse crowd: students, activists, retirees, professionals. At the front, a panel of speakers sat behind a long table. Diana was among them, her presence as steady as Chloe remembered. As Chloe found a seat near the back, the moderator, a professor with a voice that carried both authority and warmth, opened the discussion with a pointed question. "What does it mean to confront the invisible barriers that divide us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Diana was the first to respond. "It means being willing to see what we've been taught not to see," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "It means acknowledging the unspoken rules that govern our lives, rules that tell us who belongs and who doesn't." Chloe felt her chest tighten. She thought of her father's words, the lessons she had internalized without question. People need to know their place. She had carried those words with her for years, wielding them as a shield, never questioning the harm they caused. The discussion unfolded, the panelists sharing stories of systemic bias, personal resilience, and the subtle ways racism permeates everyday interactions. Each story felt like a spotlight, illuminating corners of Chloe's mind she had long ignored. She shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling exposed. When the floor opened for questions, a young woman stood, her voice trembling but determined. "How do we confront racism when it's not overt?" she asked. "When it's in the looks, the silences, the things left unsaid?" The room fell silent, the question resonating deeply. Diana leaned forward, her hands clasped on the table. "We confront it by breaking the silence," Diana said, "by naming what we see, even when it's uncomfortable, especially then." Chloe's heart raced. She thought of the man on the flight who had berated the teenager. She thought of her hesitation before stepping in, the fear that had almost silenced her. But more than that, she thought of the countless moments she hadn't acted, the times she had chosen comfort over courage. As the discussion continued, Chloe's discomfort deepened. She wanted to leave, to escape the weight of her own complicity. But something held her in place, a quiet resolve, born of the realization that she could no longer turn away. After the panel ended, the crowd lingered, forming small groups to discuss what they had heard. Chloe approached Diana, her steps hesitant but purposeful. "That was intense," Chloe said, her voice unsteady. Diana smiled gently. Intense can be good. It means you're feeling something. Chloe nodded, her throat tightening. I've been feeling a lot lately. I can't stop thinking about all the times I didn't say or do anything. All the times I just let things happen. Diana placed a hand on Chloe's shoulder. Guilt is a starting point, not a destination. What matters is what you do next. Before Chloe could respond, a commotion broke out near the entrance. Two men were arguing loudly, their voices cutting through the hum of conversation. One was black, the other white. The black man, tall and visibly frustrated, gestured toward the door. I'm telling you, I was stopped for no reason, he said, his voice rising. Just because I didn't look like I belonged here? The white man, dressed in a security uniform, looked defensive. It's standard protocol. I was just doing my job. The tension in the room was palpable. Chloe felt her pulse quicken as she watched the exchange. She noticed the way the security guard's stance mirrored authority, but his tone carried an undercurrent of bias. It was a dynamic she recognized all too well. Diana stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise. What's going on here? The security guard hesitated, clearly unnerved by Diana's presence. I thought he might be trespassing, he said, avoiding her gaze. And what made you think that? Diana asked, her tone calm but pointed. The guard stammered, unable to provide a clear answer. The black man crossed his arms, his frustration simmering beneath the surface. Chloe felt a familiar conflict rising within her, the urge to retreat, to let someone else handle it. But then she remembered Diana's words. Trying means speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable. She took a step forward. Is this how we welcome people to a space meant for inclusion? Chloe asked, her voice steady despite her racing heart. By making assumptions based on appearances? The room turned toward her, the weight of their attention pressing down. The security guard looked at Chloe, his defensiveness faltering. I didn't mean anything by it, he said quietly. But impact matters more than intent. Chloe replied, this man deserves an apology. The guard nodded reluctantly, muttering a brief apology. The black man accepted it with a curt nod, though the hurt in his eyes remained. Diana turned to Chloe, her expression one of quiet pride. Well said. Chloe exhaled deeply, the adrenaline still coursing through her. She felt exposed, but she also felt something else, something unfamiliar but powerful. She felt alive. As the evening wound down, Chloe stood outside the church, the cool night air soothing her flushed skin. Diana joined her, the two women standing in silence for a moment. That wasn't easy, Chloe said finally. It rarely is, Diana replied, but it's necessary. Chloe nodded, her gaze fixed on the horizon. For the first time, she felt the weight of her own voice not as a burden, but as a tool she was just beginning to learn how to wield. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, Chloe realized that she was no longer afraid of the discomfort. She was ready to embrace it, to let it shape her into someone who could truly make a difference. The hum of the city followed Chloe Watkins as she made her way to the airline's headquarters for a meeting she had been dreading all week. The boardroom was as sterile as she expected, long glass windows, white walls, and the faint scent of fresh coffee that never quite masked the tension in the air. She sat at the end of the polished mahogany table, surrounded by executives and senior staff, most of whom spoke in clipped tones and avoided looking directly at her. This wasn't a routine meeting. Chloe had been called in as part of a review of how the airline handled passenger relations and its response to bias-related incidents. She was here because her actions or inactions on recent flights had become the subject of scrutiny. The meeting began politely enough. Margaret Hollis, the operations manager, summarized feedback from passengers and crew. At first, the tone was neutral, even supportive, but as Margaret delved deeper into the data, her words sharpened. There's a clear pattern, Margaret said, flipping through her notes. While professionalism remains high, there are recurring issues of implicit bias in how certain passengers are treated. We're here to address that. Chloe's stomach tightened. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, their collective gaze heavy with expectation. She thought back to the flights, to moments she hadn't even realized were being noticed. The older black man with the cane, the teenager with the headphones, Diana's unflinching ability to name what others ignored. Chloe, Margaret said, her tone direct but not unkind. Would you like to share your perspective on this? Chloe hesitated, her mind racing. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down, a familiar pressure to say the right thing, to perform the role of the diligent employee. But for the first time, she felt that doing so would be a betrayal not just to herself, but to the lessons she had begun to learn. She took a deep breath. I think, she began, her voice steady but quiet, that we've been too focused on following protocol and not enough on understanding the people we're serving. The room was silent. Chloe pushed forward, her words gaining momentum. Bias isn't always overt, she said. It's in the way we hesitate to help someone because they don't look like they belong. It's in the tone we use, the assumptions we make. I know because I've done it. And I didn't even realize it until a passenger showed me what I wasn't seeing. Her voice faltered for a moment, but she steadied herself. If we want to do better, it starts with admitting that. All of us. The room erupted into murmurs. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Margaret's expression was unreadable, but she leaned back in her chair, studying Chloe carefully. Before anyone could respond, one of the senior executives, David Henley, spoke up. His voice was measured, but there was an edge to it that Chloe recognized, an attempt to reassert control. This is a complex issue, Henley said, but we have to be careful not to alienate our core customers by focusing too much on sensitivities. Chloe's chest tightened. The word hung in the air, laden with implication. Sensitivities. As if addressing bias was a frivolous indulgence, something to be balanced against the comfort of those who had never faced it. Diana's voice echoed in Chloe's mind. Trying means speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable. She straightened in her seat. With all due respect, Mr. Henley, she said, this isn't about sensitivities. It's about respect. It's about creating a space where everyone feels safe and valued, because if we don't, we're failing at our job. Henley's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The tension in the room was palpable, the air thick with the clash of unspoken beliefs. The meeting ended with promises of further training and new protocols. But Chloe knew the real work wouldn't happen in boardrooms. It would happen in the day-to-day interactions. The moments when someone chose to see or to look away. As she left the building, her phone buzzed. A message from Diana. How did it go? Chloe typed back, her fingers trembling slightly. It was hard, but I think I said what needed to be said. The reply came almost immediately. Good. That's how change starts. Later that week, Chloe was scheduled to work a high-profile flight to Chicago. One that was fully booked with corporate executives attending a major conference. The passengers filed in, their tailored suits and expensive watches a stark contrast to the occasional family or student seated in economy. Among them was a young black woman carrying a toddler on her hip and a diaper bag slung over her shoulder. Chloe noticed the way some passengers glanced at her with thinly veiled irritation as she maneuvered down the aisle. The woman struggled to secure her bag in the overhead bin while keeping hold of her child. Chloe moved quickly, offering her a reassuring smile. Let me help you with that, she said, gently taking the bag. The woman looked at her with gratitude. Thank you. It's been a day. Chloe nodded. I get it. You're doing great. The flight was smooth until turbulence struck midway through. Chloe made her way down the aisle, checking seatbelts and offering reassurances. She paused near the young mother, whose toddler was now crying inconsolably. The woman looked mortified, her cheeks flushed. I'm so sorry, she said, her voice breaking. He doesn't usually. It's okay. Chloe interrupted gently. Really, let me see if I can help. She crouched down, speaking softly to the toddler, who quieted slightly at her calm tone. The mother's eyes filled with tears, not of sadness, but of relief. As the plane descended into Chicago, Chloe felt a quiet sense of accomplishment, not because she had followed protocol, but because she had chosen to act with intention, to meet someone where they were. For the first time, she understood what Diana had meant about seeing people. That evening, Chloe called her father. She hadn't spoken to him about any of this, the flight, the training, the changes stirring within her. She wasn't sure he would understand. But as the phone rang, she realized that understanding wasn't the point. When he answered, she took a deep breath. Dad, she began, her voice steady. I need to talk to you about something. And for the first time, Chloe didn't feel afraid of what might come next. The sound of Chloe Watkins' father's voice was as familiar as it was weighty. Deep, deliberate, and filled with the authority of someone who had lived his life according to a rigid code. But tonight, that voice felt different, quieter. Perhaps it was the exhaustion in her tone, or the tremor of vulnerability she hadn't been able to mask. "You're saying I was wrong," he said finally, breaking the heavy silence. "I'm saying," Chloe paused, her throat tightening, "I'm saying that some of the things you taught me, some of the things you believed, they don't work for me anymore. They've hurt people, Dad, and I think they've hurt me too." Her father exhaled sharply, the sound heavy with discomfort. "What brought this on?" Chloe hesitated, then began to tell him about the flight with Diana Thompson, about Tom Harper's panic attack, the silent judgments in the cabin, and the ways she had failed to act. She spoke about the training program, the panel discussion, the young woman with the toddler, and the moments she could no longer ignore. Her words poured out like a flood, each one carrying a piece of the burden she had been holding for so long. When she finished, the silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "I taught you to stand tall," her father said finally, his voice low but firm. "To take control. And now you're telling me that was wrong?" Chloe closed her eyes, fighting back the sting of tears. "I'm telling you there's more to strength than control. And sometimes, standing tall means standing up for someone else." The next day, Chloe stepped into the terminal at LaGuardia Airport, her steps purposeful. She had been assigned to a flight bound for Houston, but the morning held an unexpected surprise. As she checked in with her crew, she saw a familiar figure standing near the boarding gate, Diana Thompson. "Diana?" Chloe said, her voice filled with surprise and warmth. Diana turned, her face lighting up with a smile. "Chloe, what a coincidence. Are you on this flight?" Chloe asked. Diana nodded. "Heading to Houston for a conference. I suppose we're traveling together again." Chloe couldn't help but feel a sense of comfort in Diana's presence. It was as though the universe had placed her here for a reason, as a reminder. Or perhaps as a challenge. The flight began uneventfully. Chloe worked efficiently, greeting passengers and ensuring everything ran smoothly. Diana sat quietly in her seat, her notebook open but untouched, her gaze drifting to the clouds outside. Midway through the flight, Chloe noticed a group of passengers seated in the middle rows, their conversation growing louder and more animated. At first, it seemed harmless, a few drinks, some laughter, but the tone began to shift. Snatches of their words reached Chloe's ears, each one sharper than the last. "I mean, it's not like they belong here anyway. You're not wrong. They should stick to their own." Chloe felt her stomach drop. She didn't have to look to know who they were talking about. Seated a few rows ahead was a young Middle Eastern couple, their toddler asleep in the mother's arms. The father glanced back nervously, his shoulders stiff with tension. Chloe moved toward the group, her heart pounding. As she approached, the men fell silent, their eyes narrowing as they noticed her. "Is everything okay here?" Chloe asked, her voice calm but firm. One of the men, his face flushed from alcohol, smirked. "Everything's fine, just having a conversation. A conversation that's making other passengers uncomfortable," Chloe said, her gaze steady. "I'm going to have to ask you to lower your voices and show respect to everyone on this flight." The man leaned back in his seat, his smirk fading. "We're just speaking our minds. Freedom of speech, right?" Chloe's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her voice steady. "Freedom of speech doesn't include harassing others. If it continues, I'll have to involve the captain." The men exchanged glances, muttering under their breath, but they fell silent. Chloe turned to the young couple, offering them a small, reassuring smile. The father nodded, gratitude in his eyes. Back in the galley, Chloe leaned against the counter, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She felt Diana's presence before she saw her. Turning, she found Diana standing nearby, her expression calm but watchful. "You handled that well," Diana said softly. Chloe shook her head. "I don't know. It feels like it's never enough." "It's not about fixing everything," Diana said. "It's about doing what you can, when you can." As the plane began its descent into Houston, Chloe found herself seated beside Diana during a brief break. The cabin lights were dimmed, the passengers quiet as they prepared for landing. "I called my dad last night," Chloe said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. Diana looked at her, curiosity and encouragement in her eyes. I told him I don't believe in everything he taught me anymore." Chloe continued, "That I need to see the world differently." "And how did he take it?" Diana asked gently. Chloe sighed. "Not well, but I think he heard me. And for now, That's enough. Diana smiled. It's a start. When the plane touched down, Chloe felt a strange mix of exhaustion and resolve. The flight had been another step, another test, and she had passed. But she knew the journey was far from over. As she stood at the exit, bidding passengers farewell, Diana paused beside her. You're finding your voice, Diana said. Don't stop using it. Chloe nodded, a quiet determination settling in her chest. I won't. Later that evening, as Chloe sat alone in her hotel room, she opened her notebook, the one she had started carrying after Diana's encouragement. She wrote a single sentence at the top of the page. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the refusal to let fear silence you. And for the first time, she believed it. The Houston morning was heavy with heat and the scent of fresh rain. The sky a patchwork of steel-gray clouds. Chloe Watkins stood outside the convention center, her heart pounding as she stared up at the towering glass facade. The airline had asked her to represent them at a community forum on equity and inclusion in travel, a public acknowledgement of their efforts to address bias. Chloe had agreed, but now, faced with the prospect of speaking, she felt the familiar tug of doubt. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from Diana Thompson. This is your moment. Don't let fear take it from you. Chloe exhaled sharply, slipping the phone back into her bag. Diana's faith in her felt like both a gift and a weight. She squared her shoulders and stepped inside. The forum was already bustling with energy. Rows of chairs faced a stage where a panel of speakers, including activists, business leaders, and educators, were preparing to address the crowd. Chloe spotted her name on the program. Chloe Watkins, Navigating Bias in the Skies. She took a seat near the back, her mind racing as the forum began. The speakers before her shared powerful stories of resilience, systemic inequality, and the quiet courage it took to confront injustice. Chloe listened intently, each word igniting a spark within her. But as her turn approached, the spark began to flicker, dimmed by the weight of her own expectations. When her name was called, Chloe rose slowly, her legs feeling like lead. She stepped onto the stage, the bright lights blinding her momentarily. The audience waited, their faces expectant. She took a deep breath and began. At 30,000 feet, there's nowhere to hide, Chloe said, her voice steady despite the storm within her. You're surrounded by people from every walk of life, each carrying their own stories, their own struggles, and in that confined space, the biases we carry, whether we realize it or not, have nowhere to go. She paused, scanning the crowd. I know this because I've lived it. I've seen passengers hesitate to sit beside someone who doesn't look like them. I've seen crew members, myself included, falter when faced with situations that challenge our assumptions. And I've seen what happens when silence becomes complicity. The room was silent, the weight of her words palpable. Chloe felt the familiar rush of fear, the fear of being judged, of saying the wrong thing. But she pushed through it, her voice gaining strength. I used to think professionalism meant control, she continued, that it meant following the rules, keeping your head down, and avoiding conflict. But I've learned that true professionalism, true humanity, requires us to confront the uncomfortable truths we'd rather ignore. It requires us to see people as they are, not as we expect them to be. As she spoke, Chloe saw nods ripple through the audience. But she also saw the folded arms, the furrowed brows of those who resisted her message. The tension in the room crackled, an unspoken divide between those who wanted change and those who feared it. One man in the front row, a middle-aged executive with a stern expression, raised his hand during the Q&A. When called on, he stood, his voice firm but measured. I appreciate your perspective, he said, but isn't this focus on bias just another way to divide people? Aren't we better off emphasizing unity rather than pointing out our differences? The question hung in the air, a challenge wrapped in politeness. Chloe felt her pulse quicken. She glanced at Diana, seated near the back, her calm gaze a steadying anchor. With respect, Chloe began, her voice steady but sharp. Ignoring our differences doesn't create unity. It creates silence, and silence is where bias thrives. If we want real unity, we have to address the barriers that keep us apart even when it's uncomfortable. The audience murmured, the tension thickening. Chloe could feel the pushback, the resistance from those who clung to the illusion of a harmonious world. But she also saw the glimmers of understanding, the quiet nods, the softening expressions of those who were beginning to see. As the forum concluded, Chloe stepped off the stage, her chest tight with a mix of relief and exhaustion. She made her way toward Diana, who was waiting near the back of the room. "You did well," Diana said, her voice warm. Chloe shook her head. "I don't know. It felt like I was talking to a wall." Diana smiled faintly. "Change isn't about knocking walls down all at once. It's about planting seeds in the cracks. And you planted plenty today." Later that evening, Chloe found herself alone in her hotel room, the city lights casting long shadows on the walls. She thought of the man in the audience, of his resistance to her words. She thought of her father, whose silence after their conversation still lingered like an unanswered question. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Diana. "Proud of you. The work isn't easy, but it's worth it." Chloe stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "I just hope it's enough." The reply came almost immediately. "It never feels like enough. That's why we keep going." Chloe set her phone down and looked out the window. The city sprawling beneath her. The fault lines of bias and division ran deep. But for the first time, she felt steady enough to walk them. And with each step, she knew she was finding her own way forward. The storm began as they ascended. The Houston sky, streaked with a threatening gray, seemed determined to remind Chloe Watkins that even journeys taken with purpose often encounter resistance. The flight was bound for New York, but the tension in the cabin mirrored the turbulence outside, a fragile calm punctuated by occasional jolts. Chloe moved through the aisles with practiced precision, but her mind was elsewhere, caught between the weight of her words at the forum and the resistance they had stirred. Seated in first class, Diana Thompson watched Chloe quietly. Though the younger woman's movements were fluid and professional, Diana could see the strain etched in her face, the tightness in her jaw, the faint tremble in her hands. Diana had seen this before, in students and activists alike. The moment when conviction met resistance, when the rush of purpose began to yield to doubt. Chloe paused by Diana's seat. "Everything okay here?" Diana nodded but tilted her head slightly, her eyes searching Chloe's. "Is it okay with you?" Chloe blinked, caught off guard. "I'm fine," she said quickly, but the words felt hollow even to her. "Fine isn't the same as steady," Diana replied, her voice soft but pointed. "And steady doesn't mean unshaken." Chloe looked away, her lips pressing into a thin line. She wanted to say something, to explain the weight she felt pressing against her chest. But there was no time. A commotion erupted a few rows back. The voices were sharp, cutting through the cabin's hum. A man in his 50s, seated in economy, was arguing with a flight attendant. His tone was defensive, his words barbed. "I'm not going to move," he said loudly, gesturing to the seat beside him. "I paid for this seat. And I'm not sitting next to someone like that." Chloe's heart sank as she glanced at the person seated beside him, a young black man in his 20s. His earbuds dangling from his neck, his posture tense but calm. The young man stared straight ahead, his jaw tight, his hands gripping the edges of his seat. Chloe moved toward the scene, her pulse quickening. She could feel the weight of the passengers' stares, their anticipation thick in the air. The older man's voice grew louder as she approached. "I have a right to be comfortable," he snapped. "And I don't feel comfortable." Chloe stopped beside the row, her voice firm but calm. "Sir, what seems to be the problem?" The man turned to her, his face red with anger. "The problem is him," he said, pointing to the young man beside him. "I don't want to sit next to him." Chloe's chest tightened. She could feel the cabin holding its breath, every passenger waiting to see what she would do. For a brief moment, her father's voice echoed in her mind. "Control the situation. Chloe, don't let it spiral." But another voice, Diana's, rose above it. "Trying means speaking up, even when it's uncomfortable." "Sir," Chloe said, her tone steady, "this is about more than comfort. It's about respect. And right now, you're making this flight uncomfortable for everyone." The man's eyes widened. "Are you taking his side?" "I'm taking the side of decency," Chloe said firmly. "You have a choice. You can remain in your seat and treat your neighbor with respect. Or we can discuss this further after the captain is informed." The man opened his mouth to argue, but the murmurs from the surrounding passengers gave him pause. He glanced around, his indignation faltering under the weight of their judgment. Finally, he slumped back in his seat, muttering under his breath. Chloe turned to the young man, her voice softening. "Are you okay?" The young man nodded, his voice quiet. "Thank you." Chloe smiled faintly, her chest loosening as she returned to the galley. But the relief was short-lived. As she leaned against the counter, her hands trembling slightly, Diana appeared beside her. "You handled that well," Diana said. Chloe shook her head. "It didn't feel like enough." "It never does." Diana's expression softened. "Because it isn't. Not on its own. But it's a step. And steps build bridges." The flight continued, the turbulence outside mirroring the unease within Chloe. She thought of the man in the audience at the forum, of her father's silence, of the passengers who had watched her confrontation unfold. She thought of the young man in the seat, his quiet dignity a mirror to her own growing resilience. As the plane began its descent into New York, Chloe felt a strange sense of clarity. She had spent so much of her life trying to control the world around her, to fit herself into a mold defined by rules and expectations. But control, she realized, wasn't the answer. Connection was. When the plane landed and the passengers began to disembark, Chloe stood by the exit, her smile genuine for the first time in what felt like weeks. The young black man paused as he passed her, his gaze steady. "You didn't have to do that," he said quietly. "But you did. So, thank you." Chloe nodded, her voice catching. "You're welcome." Later that evening, Chloe sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone. She scrolled through her contacts until she found her father's name. For a long moment, she hesitated. Then she dialed. "Chloe," he answered, his voice gruff but familiar. "Hi, Dad," she said, her voice steady. "I just wanted to tell you about something that happened today. About a choice I made." As she spoke, Chloe felt a shift, a quiet but undeniable transformation taking root. She wasn't the same woman who had boarded that plane months ago, full of certainty but empty of understanding. She was someone new, someone who had learned to embrace discomfort, to confront the unspoken, to plant seeds in the cracks. And as her father listened in silence, Chloe realized that the most important journeys weren't taken at 30,000 feet. They were the ones that reshaped the heart, one step at a time.